I was not supposed to recognize my own wife's name on a wall she swore she had never touched. The plaque was mounted in brushed steel beside the reception desk, polished to a mirror shine under the lobby lights, and it read in clean, confident lettering, Vanessa Hale, Chief Executive Officer, since 2008. I stood there longer than any visitor should, long enough for the receptionist to glance up twice, and then look away, pretending not to notice. My fingers tightened around the strap of my leather briefcase, the same one I had carried for 15 years, worn at the edges, familiar in a way that grounded me. Because nothing else in that moment felt familiar. Vanessa had told me, more than once, that her involvement with that company ended years ago. She called it a consulting phase, a stepping stone, something temporary she had outgrown. I remembered the exact tone she used, casual, almost dismissive, like it was not worth remembering. And yet here her name was, engraved into metal, not as a past role, not as a consultant, but as the Chief Executive Officer, with a start date that stretched back over a decade. The lobby itself did not match the version of reality I had been living in either. It was not the modest office space she had described. It was expansive, almost intimidating, with marble floors that reflected the ceiling lights like still water, glass walls that framed conference rooms filled with people in tailored suits, and a security desk staffed by a man who looked like he had been trained to notice everything. He noticed me. I could feel it before I looked up. His eyes tracked the way I stared at the plaque, the way I did not move, the way I seemed out of place in a building that operated on quiet confidence and precise control. I forced myself to shift, to step forward, to act like I belonged there, even though a part of me already knew I did not. Not in this version of her world. Not in this version of the truth. I had come to that building on a simple impulse, something almost embarrassingly ordinary. Vanessa had mentioned she would be working late again, another long evening filled with meetings that supposedly never ended, and I thought I would surprise her. I thought I would bring her coffee, maybe remind her that there was still a life outside of whatever consumed her time. It was a small gesture, the kind you make after decades of marriage when you believe you understand the rhythm of someone's life. But standing there, staring at that plaque, I realized I might not understand anything at all. I did not feel anger. Not yet. What I felt was something colder, something more precise. A quiet awareness that the story I had been told did not match the evidence in front of me. And when that happens, you do not react. You observe. Because somewhere between what she said and what this building revealed, there was a truth she had never intended for me to find. And I had just walked straight into it. I had heard her say it so many times that it had become background noise, something I never thought to question until now. It usually came late at night, when she would loosen her heels at the front door and drop her keys into the ceramic bowl by the hallway table, the soft clink echoing through the house like a routine we had repeated for years. I would ask how her day went, and she would give me the same answer in different variations. Long meetings, endless emails, clients who could not make decisions. And every now and then, when I pressed just a little further, she would mention that old company, always with the same tone, detached, almost amused. She would say it was behind her. She would say she had moved on. She would say it was never really hers to begin with. I remember one specific night about 3 years ago, sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she stood across from me scrolling through her phone. I had seen the company name on a document she left open on her laptop, and I asked her directly if she still had any involvement. She did not hesitate. She looked up, met my eyes, and smiled in a way that felt practiced even then, though I could not explain why at the time. She said no. She said it clearly, simply, without any room for interpretation. Just consulting work, she added, like it was an afterthought. A temporary thing. Nothing that mattered anymore. I believed her. Not because the explanation made perfect sense, but because after 25 years of marriage, you build your life on a foundation of trust that you do not think to test every day. You accept the version of reality you are given, especially when it comes from someone you have shared a home, a history, and a future with. But standing there in that lobby, the memory of that conversation felt different. It did not feel like a harmless simplification anymore. It felt like a carefully placed piece in a larger pattern I had never noticed. I shifted my weight slightly, pretending to check my watch, using the reflection in the polished surface of the front desk to study the space without making it obvious. Employees moved through the lobby with quiet efficiency, some carrying tablets, others speaking in low, focused tones. A woman in a navy suit walked past me and gave a small nod in the direction of the plaque, almost like a reflex, like acknowledging authority without thinking about it. That detail settled somewhere deep in my mind. People do not react that way to someone who is no longer relevant. They do not carry that kind of unconscious respect for a name that supposedly belongs to the past. I looked back at the plaque again, this time focusing on the date. Since 2008. That was not a short consulting period. That was a position held for over a decade. A position that overlapped completely with the life we had built together, with the house we bought, with the decisions we made as a couple. Which meant one of two things had to be true. Either she had minimized her role to avoid unnecessary detail, or she had deliberately hidden something that was never meant for me to see. The second possibility did not feel dramatic. It felt precise, controlled, like a decision made long before I ever walked into this building. I became aware of the security guard again, his presence steady, his posture relaxed but attentive. He had not looked away from me for long. There was something in his expression now that I could not quite define, not suspicion, not exactly concern, but recognition of a situation he had seen before in a different form. I stepped closer to the desk, forcing a polite smile, the kind you use when you are about to ask a simple question. My voice, when I finally spoke, sounded calm, steady, like nothing had shifted inside me at all. But the truth was, everything had already begun to shift, piece by piece, into something I was only starting to understand. The receptionist looked up the moment I stepped within a few feet of the desk, her expression shifting into that polished, professional smile that belongs to people trained to handle anything without showing too much of themselves. There was a tablet in front of her, angled slightly to the side, and I caught a glimpse of a digital directory scrolling slowly, names and titles arranged with quiet authority. I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the marble counter, feeling the cool surface against my skin, grounding myself before I spoke. "Good afternoon," I said, keeping my tone even, almost casual. "I am here to see Vanessa." I did not say her last name. I did not need to. The reaction came instantly, though it was subtle enough that most people would have missed it. Her posture straightened just a fraction, and her fingers paused over the screen as if she had been expecting that name to come from someone like me, but not in this exact way. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" she asked, her voice smooth, controlled, but carrying a note of formality that had not been there when she greeted other visitors. I shook my head slightly, offering a small apologetic smile. "No appointment. I was in the area and thought I would stop by." It was not entirely a lie, but it was far from the truth. She studied me for a second longer than necessary, her eyes moving from my face to my clothes, to the briefcase at my side, as if trying to place me within a framework that made sense to her. Then she nodded, turning back to her tablet. "Ms. Hale is in meetings this afternoon," she said, her fingers moving again, tapping through a schedule I could not see. "She has been in back-to-back sessions since 11 this morning." I glanced at the large clock mounted on the wall behind her. It was just past 2:30. That meant at least 3.5 hours of meetings, possibly more. That detail settled into my mind alongside everything else. Another piece that did not match the version of her day she had described earlier that morning when she left the house. "That sounds like her," I replied, keeping my voice light, as if I were simply making conversation. "She stays busy." The receptionist gave a small, polite smile, but it did not reach her eyes. "Yes, sir," she said. "Very busy." There was something in the way she said it, something that suggested a level of familiarity that went beyond what you would expect from someone describing a former consultant. I let a moment pass, then leaned slightly closer, lowering my voice just enough to create the impression of a private question. "Would you mind letting her know that Richard stopped by?" I said. "She will understand." I chose my words carefully, watching for any shift in her expression. It came again, sharper this time. Recognition. Not of me, but of the name. Her eyes flickered back to me, searching, recalculating. "Richard," she repeated, as if testing the sound of it against something she already knew. Then she gave a small nod, though I could tell it was more reflex than certainty. "Of course, sir. I can leave a message." She did not reach for the phone. She did not signal anyone. She simply typed something into her tablet, her movements precise, controlled. I followed the motion of her hands, noticing the way the screen reflected faintly in the marble, the lines of text too distorted to read clearly. But I did not need to read it to understand one thing. She was not treating this like a routine visitor message. There was a weight to it, a hesitation she was trying to conceal. Behind me, the glass doors opened with a soft mechanical sound, and a group of executives stepped inside, their voices low, their movements confident. One of them glanced briefly in our direction, then quickly looked away, as if the exchange at the desk was something he did not want to be part of. That, too, felt significant. I straightened slightly, stepping back from the counter. "I appreciate it," I said. "No rush. I know how her schedule can get." The receptionist nodded again, but this time there was a faint tightness in her smile, something that suggested she was no longer entirely comfortable with the situation. "Is there anything else I can assist you with?" she asked. I paused, letting my gaze drift briefly toward the elevator bank behind her. The polished steel doors reflected the lobby like a distorted mirror, and above them, a digital panel displayed the floors as they moved up and down. I counted them automatically, 1 through 16, then stopped. Something was missing. I turned back to her, my expression neutral. "No," I said quietly. "That will be all." But as I stepped away from the desk, my mind was no longer on the conversation. It was on the elevator panel, on the numbers that had appeared and the one that had not, and the growing sense that whatever Vanessa had hidden was not just contained in a name on a plaque, but somewhere higher up in a building that did not show all of its floors. I did not walk toward the elevators right away. That would have been too obvious, too direct, and something about this place told me that direct questions did not get answered here, at least not honestly. Instead, I slowed my pace and moved toward the seating area along the glass wall, where a row of low leather chairs faced the street outside. From there, I could still see the elevator bank clearly, along with the digital panel above it. The numbers moved in a steady rhythm, lighting up as the cars traveled between floors, but each time they reached the top, they stopped at 16. There was no 17. Not on the display, not on the directory behind the reception desk, not anywhere visible to someone standing in the lobby. And yet I had counted the building from the outside before I walked in. 17 floors. I was certain of it. The top level had tinted glass that reflected the sky differently than the rest, darker, more private. I sat down slowly, placing my briefcase beside my leg, and leaned back just enough to appear relaxed. My eyes stayed on the panel, tracking the movement, waiting for something that did not quite belong. It came a few minutes later, subtle, almost easy to miss. One of the elevators reached 16 and paused longer than the others. The doors did not open. The panel did not change. Then, without any visible input, the indicator flickered once and went dark for a fraction of a second before resetting. When it lit up again, the car was descending. No announcement. No floor indicated. Just a brief interruption in the pattern, like a heartbeat skipping a beat. I exhaled slowly, keeping my face neutral, but inside, something clicked into place. A hidden floor was not a design choice you made by accident. It was deliberate, controlled, meant to exist without being acknowledged. My attention shifted slightly as a man in a tailored gray suit approached the elevator bank. He did not hesitate. He did not check his phone or glance at the directory. He walked straight to the center panel and pressed a sequence that I could not fully see from where I was sitting. The panel did not light up in the same way it had for the others. Instead, there was a soft tone, lower than the standard chime, and the doors opened almost immediately. He stepped inside, and for a brief second, before the doors closed, I saw his hand move toward a section of the control panel that was not visible from the outside, a small recessed area that suggested additional options. The doors shut smoothly, sealing him off from view. The indicator above remained blank for a moment, then resumed its normal cycle, as if nothing had happened. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, my fingers interlaced. This was no longer about a name on a plaque or a vague explanation about consulting work. This was infrastructure. Systems designed to separate information, to control access, to keep certain things hidden in plain sight. I let my gaze drift back toward the reception desk, where the woman was still typing, her posture composed, her attention focused on the screen. From this angle, I could see the edge of the directory display again, and I noticed something I had not registered before. The list of floors stopped at 16, but the spacing between entries fell off, as if something had been removed rather than never included. A gap, subtle but intentional. I stood up slowly, adjusting my jacket, and picked up my briefcase. There was no reason to sit any longer. I had seen enough to know that whatever existed above that visible structure was not meant for casual visitors, and certainly not for someone like me, someone who had been told a version of the truth that now felt incomplete at best. As I walked back toward the center of the lobby, I became aware of the security guard again. His gaze met mine briefly, and this time, there was no attempt to hide it. There was recognition there, but also something else. Hesitation, as if he was deciding whether to say something or remain silent. I slowed just enough to give him the opportunity, not turning fully, not stopping completely, just enough to acknowledge that I had noticed him. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he shifted his weight slightly, leaning forward just a fraction, his voice low enough that it would not carry beyond the desk. "Sir," he said quietly, "if you are here about her, you might want to be careful about where you go next." The words were simple, but the tone behind them carried weight. Not a warning meant to scare, but one meant to inform. I looked at him for a moment, measuring the intent, then gave a small nod, as if I had heard nothing more than casual advice. "I appreciate that," I replied, my voice just as low. I did not ask him to explain. I did not press for details. Because whatever he knew, he was not going to say it out loud. Not here, not in a place designed to listen without appearing to. I turned toward the elevators then, my reflection staring back at me from the polished steel doors, and for the first time since I walked into that building, I felt the full weight of what I was about to do. Not confront her. Not yet. Just step into a space she had never intended me to enter. I pressed the call button once, not too quickly, not too slowly, and kept my expression neutral as I waited. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, the doors sliding open to reveal a polished interior lined with brushed metal and a mirrored back wall that reflected me in a way that felt more revealing than I was comfortable with. I stepped inside, alone, and turned slightly so I could still see the lobby behind me as the doors closed. The receptionist did not look up. The guard did not move. The building swallowed the moment as if it had never happened. Inside, the control panel was exactly what I expected at first glance. Floors 1 through 16, neatly arranged, each button backlit in a soft white glow. No sign of anything beyond that. No 17. No hidden option. Just a clean, ordinary interface that matched the illusion downstairs. I did not press a button immediately. Instead, I let the doors close fully, sealing me in, and watched the panel for a second longer than necessary. Then I reached out and pressed 16. If there was something above it, I would find it from there. The elevator moved smoothly, almost silently, the numbers lighting up in sequence as we ascended. 2, 4, 7, 10. Each floor passing with the same quiet precision, the same controlled rhythm I had already seen from the lobby. I stood perfectly still, my hands relaxed at my sides, my reflection watching me from the mirror behind. By the time it reached 15, I had already decided what I would do next. The car stopped at 16 with a soft tone, the doors opening onto a hallway that felt different the moment I saw it. It was quieter than the floors below, the lighting softer, warmer, the kind of space designed for fewer people, more privacy. The carpet absorbed sound, the walls were lined with framed abstracts instead of corporate signage, and there was no visible reception desk. Just a corridor that stretched in both directions, clean, controlled, and deliberately understated. I stepped out slowly, letting the doors close behind me without turning around. The silence settled immediately, not empty, but contained, like a place where conversations happened behind closed doors and did not leave the room. I took a few steps forward, my shoes making almost no sound against the carpet, and glanced down the hallway. Office doors lined the walls, each marked with small metal plates, but none of them carried her name. That, more than anything, confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Whatever she was doing here, it was not meant to be found through normal channels. I walked toward the end of the corridor where a large window overlooked the city, the skyline stretching out in the distance under a pale afternoon sky. From this height, everything looked smaller, distant, manageable. I paused there for a moment, letting my reflection blend with the glass, then turned back toward the elevator. The panel outside the doors matched the one inside. Floors 1 through 16. Nothing more. But this time, I looked closer. There was a faint seam along the edge of the panel, almost invisible unless you were standing at the right angle. And just below it, near waist height, a small dark rectangle no larger than a keycard reader, flush with the surface. I had missed it before, or maybe it had not been obvious until I knew to look for it. I stepped closer, pretending to check my phone as I shifted my position, bringing my hand near the panel without drawing attention to the movement. That was when I heard footsteps behind me, soft but deliberate. I did not turn immediately. I did not react. I simply waited, letting the sound come closer, measuring the pace, the weight. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, it was not the guard or the receptionist. It was a woman in her early 40s, dressed in a tailored black suit, carrying a slim folder under her arm. She slowed when she saw me, just slightly, her eyes taking in the scene with a quick, practiced scan. Then her gaze flicked to the panel beside me, to the exact spot where my hand hovered. For a fraction of a second, something passed across her face. Recognition, not of me, but of what I was about to do. She recovered instantly, her expression smoothing back into professional neutrality. But the moment had already happened. She knew that I did not belong there. And more importantly, she knew that I had noticed something I was not supposed to see. She stopped a few feet away, just within conversational distance, her voice calm, controlled, but carrying a quiet firmness. "This level is restricted," she said. "Visitors usually wait downstairs." I lowered my hand slowly, as if I had simply been resting it there without intention, and gave a small, polite nod. "I was just leaving," I replied, my tone matching hers. No challenge, no explanation, just enough to keep the moment from escalating. She studied me for a second longer, her eyes sharp, assessing, then inclined her head slightly and moved past me toward the panel. I did not turn to watch her directly. I did not need to. In the reflection of the elevator doors, I saw everything I needed. Her hand moved with certainty, tapping a sequence on the panel that was not visible from the front. The seam I had noticed shifted almost imperceptibly, revealing a hidden interface. A soft tone sounded, different from the standard chime, lower, more controlled. And then, for the briefest moment before the doors closed between us, I saw a number appear on the panel that had not existed before. 17. I did not move when the doors closed. I did not turn around, and I did not let my expression change. I simply stood there, watching the reflection fade as the elevator carried her upward to a floor that did not officially exist. 17. The number lingered in my mind longer than it should have, not because it was surprising, but because it confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. This was not a misunderstanding. This was structure, intentional, layered, and carefully maintained over time. I exhaled slowly and stepped back toward the center of the hallway, giving the appearance of someone who had simply lost his way for a moment. My pace remained steady as I walked back to the elevator, pressing the visible call button like any other visitor would. When the doors opened again, I stepped inside without hesitation and pressed one. I did not look at the panel this time. I did not search for the hidden seam or the concealed interface. I already knew it was there. What mattered now was not forcing my way upward, but understanding how far this system extended and how long it had been in place. The elevator descended smoothly, each floor lighting up in sequence as if nothing unusual existed beyond the visible structure. By the time it reached the lobby, my breathing had returned to normal, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral. I stepped out into the open space again, the marble floors and glass walls welcoming me back into a version of reality that was easier to explain, easier to accept if you did not look too closely. The receptionist glanced up as I approached, her eyes flickering with recognition, but she did not speak. The message she had typed earlier still lingered somewhere in her system, waiting to be seen, waiting to be interpreted. I gave her a small nod as I passed, the kind you offer when nothing significant has happened. The guard, however, was watching me more closely now. His posture had shifted slightly, his attention more focused, as if he had been tracking my movement through the building even without following me physically. I slowed just enough to meet his gaze for a second time, letting the silence sit between us. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the elevators, then back at me, his expression tightening in a way that suggested he had already seen enough to understand what I had discovered. "You found it," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement. I did not answer right away. I let a small pause settle, then gave the slightest nod. Nothing more. That was enough. He exhaled under his breath, his shoulders lowering just a fraction. Most people do not even notice, he added, his voice still low, careful not to carry. They come in, they see what they are supposed to see, and they leave. I studied him for a moment, measuring the weight behind his words. There was no curiosity in his tone, no attempt to gather information from me. If anything, there was a hint of resignation, like someone who had watched this pattern unfold before and knew how it ended. How long has it been there? I asked, keeping my voice just as controlled, just as contained. He hesitated, not because he did not know the answer, but because he was deciding how much he was willing to say. His eyes shifted briefly toward the reception desk, then back to me. Long enough, he said finally. Long enough that nobody questions it anymore. That answer told me more than a specific number ever could. This was not a recent development. It was not something she had set up in the last few months, or even the last few years. It had been part of her world for a long time, existing quietly alongside the life we shared, never intersecting in a way that forced it into the open. I nodded again, acknowledging the information without pressing further. There was no point in asking him for details he would not give. Not here, not in a space designed to monitor conversations as much as control movement. I adjusted my grip on the briefcase and turned toward the exit, the glass doors reflecting the street outside in sharp, clean lines. As I stepped through them and felt the cooler air of the city against my face, I realized something that settled deeper than anything I had seen inside that building. This was not about catching her in a lie. It was about understanding the scale of it, the time it had taken, the planning, the decision, made again and again over the years, to keep that part of her life separate from mine. I paused on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the structure from the outside again. 17 floors. The top level darker, more reflective, set apart in a way that now felt deliberate instead of architectural. Somewhere up there, behind glass that did not reveal what was inside, was a version of Vanessa I had never been introduced to. And for the first time since I saw her name on that plaque, I understood that walking into that building had not been the real discovery. It had only been the beginning of something much larger, something that was not going to stay contained within those walls for much longer. I did not go home right away. That would have been the expected move, the natural continuation of a normal day, and nothing about what I had just seen felt normal anymore. Instead, I walked 2 blocks down the street and turned into a small cafe I had passed 100 times but never entered. It was quiet inside, the kind of place where conversations stayed low and people kept to themselves. I ordered a black coffee, nothing fancy, and took a seat by the window where I could still see the building in the distance, its glass surface reflecting the late afternoon light in a way that made it look almost ordinary again. I set my briefcase on the table and rested my hands around the cup, letting the heat settle into my fingers while my mind moved through everything I had just experienced, not quickly, not emotionally, but carefully, piece by piece. Vanessa had left the house that morning like she always did, her schedule already set in her head, her movements efficient, controlled. She had mentioned meetings, said she might be late, said not to wait for dinner. There had been nothing unusual in her tone, nothing that suggested she was about to walk into a world she had never allowed me to see. And yet, that was exactly what she had done. Or maybe more accurately, that was the world she had been living in all along. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the bitterness ground me, and began to think through the timeline in a way I never had before. 2008. That was the year on the plaque. The year she supposedly became chief executive officer. I leaned back slightly, staring out the window, and let that date settle. 2008 was not a distant memory. It was a year I knew well. It was the year we refinanced the house. The year we talked about cutting back on expenses, about simplifying things, about focusing on stability instead of expansion. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table with her, going over numbers, making decisions together, or at least believing we were. If she had already been in that position at the time, if she had already been running something of that scale, then those conversations were not what I thought they were. They were not joint decisions. They were carefully managed narratives. I set the cup down slowly, my fingers lingering on the rim, and reached for my phone. Not to call her. Not yet. Instead, I opened a browser and typed in the company name exactly as I had seen it on the plaque. The results came up instantly, but they were not as straightforward as I expected. The company existed, but the public information was limited, almost intentionally vague. A holding firm, private ownership, minimal disclosures. The kind of structure that does not invite attention, that operates within layers designed to obscure more than they reveal. I scrolled further, looking for anything that connected directly to her name. There were mentions, but not in the way you would expect for someone in her position. No press interviews, no executive profiles, just references buried in filings, partial names, variations that required you to already know what you were looking for. Vanessa Hale, not Hale. The difference was small, almost invisible if you were not paying attention. I stared at that for a second longer than necessary, the spelling settling into place like a piece of a puzzle I had not known existed. It was not a mistake. It was a variation, deliberate enough to create distance, subtle enough to avoid raising questions. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and continued digging, opening documents, scanning through lines of legal language that most people would skip over without a second thought. Ownership structures, trust entities, layered management, names that repeated in different combinations, connected in ways that were not immediately obvious unless you traced them carefully. And there it was again. Hale, attached to a trust that held controlling interest in multiple properties, including the building I had just walked out of. I sat back slowly, letting the information settle, not reacting, not jumping to conclusions, just absorbing what was there. This was not a side project. This was not a consulting role she had downplayed out of convenience. This was a foundation, something built over time, protected, structured in a way that kept it separate from everything else. Separate from me. I glanced back out the window at the building, its top floor catching the light differently than the rest, and for the first time, I understood that the hidden level was not the most important secret she had kept. It was simply the most visible one, once you knew where to look. The real secret was how long she had been living this second life, and how carefully she had ensured that it never touched the one we shared. And as I sat there, the quiet hum of the cafe around me, I realized that whatever came next was not going to be about asking her questions she could answer. It was going to be about uncovering things she had never intended to explain at all. I did not close the browser when I finished reading. I left the documents open, the tabs stacked across the top of the screen like a trail I could return to at any moment. Instead, I reached for my phone again and scrolled through my contacts. Not quickly, not hesitantly, just with the kind of deliberate pace that comes when you already know exactly who you are going to call. Evelyn Shaw. I had not spoken to her in over 2 years, not since she helped me restructure a small investment portfolio after my last consulting contract ended. She was precise, discreet, and more importantly, she understood how to read between lines that were never meant to be obvious. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear, my gaze still fixed on the building across the street. It rang twice before she answered. "Richard," she said, her voice calm, professional, but carrying that same quiet sharpness I remembered. "This is unexpected." I allowed a small pause before responding, not because I needed time, but because I wanted to set the tone correctly. "I need you to look at something," I said. No explanation, no context, just a request. There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that suggested she was already shifting into a different mode of thinking. "All right," she replied. "Send it over." I ended the call without adding anything else and forwarded her the documents I had opened, along with the company name and the variation of Vanessa's name exactly as it appeared in the filings. Then I placed the phone back on the table and waited. Not impatiently, not anxiously, just waiting, the way you do when you know the next piece of information is already on its way. Outside, the light had shifted slightly, the reflections on the building changing as the sun moved lower in the sky. From this angle, the top floor looked even more distinct, the glass darker, almost opaque compared to the levels below. It was subtle, something most people would never notice unless they were looking for it. I watched it for a moment longer, then returned my attention to the phone as it vibrated softly against the table. Evelyn did not waste time. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her tone no longer neutral. There was focus in it now, and something else. Interest. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice steady. "Does it matter?" Another pause. Shorter this time. "It might," she said, "because what you sent me is not standard." I let that settle for a second before responding. "In what way?" I asked. I could hear the faint sound of papers shifting on her end, the quiet rhythm of someone reviewing information quickly but thoroughly. The structure, she said. This is layered. Multiple entities, multiple jurisdictions. It is designed to separate ownership from identity. I glanced back at the building, my reflection faint in the window glass beside me. And the name? I asked. The variation. Intentional, she replied immediately. It creates legal distance without breaking continuity. It allows someone to operate in parallel without drawing direct connections unless you know exactly what to look for. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it. That matched what I had already begun to understand, but hearing it confirmed by someone like her gave it weight. There is more, she continued, her tone tightening just a fraction. The trust attached to this, it is not just holding assets. It is controlling them. Full authority. And it has been active for a long time. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, letting that information settle into place. Since 2008? I asked. There was a slight pause before she answered. At least, she said. Possibly earlier in a different form, but that is when it became visible in this structure. I opened my eyes again, my gaze returning to the building, to the top floor that now felt less like an architectural detail and more like a boundary. And what about recent activity? I asked. Anything that stands out? This time, the pause was longer. Not hesitation. Calculation. Yes, she said finally. There was an amendment filed within the last 6 months. Quietly. No public announcement. But it changes the distribution framework. My fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. In what way? I asked. I already knew the answer was not going to be simple. It narrows access, she said. Consolidates control. And more importantly, it redefines beneficiary conditions. I let the word sit for a moment before asking the only question that mattered. Does my name appear anywhere in that structure? There was no delay this time. No, she said. Just that. No explanation. No qualification. I exhaled slowly, the air leaving my lungs in a controlled, measured way. Not surprise. Not shock. Just confirmation of something that had already taken shape in my mind. All right, I said quietly. I need you to dig deeper. Everything connected to that trust. Every entity. Every amendment. I want a full picture. There was a brief silence, then a single, clear response. Understood, she said. I ended the call and set the phone down again, my gaze drifting back to the building one more time. The city moved around it like nothing had changed, cars passing, people walking, the rhythm of a normal afternoon continuing without interruption. But from where I sat, nothing about it felt normal anymore. Because now I was not just looking at a place she had hidden from me. I was looking at a system she had built, protected, and recently adjusted in a way that did not include me at all. And whatever that amendment meant, whatever it was preparing for, I had the distinct sense that I had walked into the middle of it without her ever expecting me to notice. I did not leave the cafe immediately after the call. There was no urgency in my movements, no outward sign that anything had shifted beneath the surface, but internally, everything had already begun to rearrange itself into a clearer structure. I closed my laptop slowly, not because I was finished, but because I had reached a point where gathering more raw information would not change what I already understood. This was no longer about discovery. It was about interpretation. I settled back into the chair, my gaze drifting once more toward the building across the street, but this time I was not studying its design or its hidden details. I was thinking about timing. 6 months. That was what Evelyn had said. An amendment filed quietly, altering control, narrowing access, redefining beneficiaries. That kind of move was not reactive. It was preparatory. It meant something had been anticipated, planned for in advance, structured in a way that allowed for transition without disruption. I picked up my phone again, not to call anyone this time, but to scroll through something far more familiar. Our shared calendar. Vanessa and I had always kept things organized, coordinated schedules, tracked events, appointments, travel. It was one of those small systems that made long-term relationships function smoothly. At least, that was how I had always viewed it. Now, I was looking at it differently. I moved through the entries carefully, not just the past few weeks, but the last several months, aligning dates in my mind with what Evelyn had told me. There it was. Subtle at first, almost invisible unless you were looking for patterns. More late nights than usual. More client meetings that extended beyond normal hours. A series of out-of-town trips that had seemed routine at the time, but now felt coordinated. Not random, not reactive, structured. I paused on one specific entry from just over 5 months ago. A 3-day trip she had described as a consulting conference in Chicago. I remembered that one clearly because she had almost canceled it at the last minute, saying the schedule was uncertain, that it might not be worth attending. She had gone anyway. When she returned, she had been quieter for a few days, more focused, more precise in her routines. At the time, I had assumed it was just fatigue from travel. Now, it felt different. It felt like a pivot point. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table again, and continued scrolling. 2 months after that trip, another entry stood out. A meeting labeled simply as legal review, scheduled for a full afternoon, with no additional notes. That was not typical for her. She rarely used vague labels in a system that was built on clarity. I tapped on the entry, opening the details, but there was nothing more to see. No location, no participants, just a block of time set aside and marked as private. I exhaled slowly, my mind connecting the sequence without forcing it. Conference. Adjustment in behavior. Legal review. Amendment filed within the same general time frame. It was not proof, not in the legal sense, but it was alignment. Enough to suggest that whatever changes had been made to that trust were not isolated decisions. They were part of a larger plan. I set the phone down and looked out at the street again, watching as people moved through their routines, unaware of the structure I was now beginning to see. Cars passed, traffic lights changed, the rhythm of the city continued uninterrupted. And above it all, the building stood exactly as it had before, unchanged, unremarkable to anyone who had not looked closely enough. I thought about the guard's words. Most people do not even notice. He was right, because noticing requires a shift in perspective, a willingness to question what you have accepted without examining. And once you make that shift, once you start seeing the inconsistencies, the patterns become harder to ignore. I reached for my briefcase and opened it, pulling out a small notebook I had not used in months. It was nothing special, just a standard lined pad, but it served a purpose. I flipped it open to a blank page and began writing, not in full sentences, not in explanations, but in fragments. Dates, keywords, connections. 2008. Trust formation. 5 months ago, Chicago. 2 months later, legal review. 6 months ago, amendment filed. I paused for a moment, pen hovering above the page, then added one more line. 17. Not as a floor number, but as a marker. A point of separation between what was visible and what was not. I closed the notebook and slid it back into the briefcase, my movements calm, controlled. There was no need to rush. Whatever Vanessa had set in motion had been building for years. Taking a few more hours, or even a few more days, to understand it fully was not going to change its trajectory. But it would change how I responded to it. And that was what mattered now. Not confrontation. Not yet. Preparation. Because if she had taken steps to redefine control and exclude me from something this significant, then there was a reason. And reasons like that did not exist in isolation. They pointed forward, towards something that had not happened yet. Something she expected. Something she had already positioned herself for. I stood up slowly, leaving the empty coffee cup on the table, and stepped out of the cafe back onto the sidewalk. The air felt cooler now, the lights softer as the afternoon edged toward evening. I adjusted my jacket, glanced once more at the building, and then turned away, not because I was done with it, but because I knew the next part of this was not going to happen there. It was going to happen somewhere she thought was safe, somewhere she believed I would never think to look. By the time I reached home, the sun had already dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the driveway, stretching everything into shapes that felt slightly distorted, slightly unfamiliar. The house looked exactly the same as it always did. Clean lines, well-kept lawn, the front porch light still off because it was not quite dark yet. Nothing about it suggested that anything had changed. And yet, as I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I realized that I was no longer walking into the same space I had left that morning. I placed my briefcase on the entry table, right beside the ceramic bowl where Vanessa always dropped her keys, and paused for a moment, letting the silence settle. It was quiet in that comfortable, familiar way, but now it felt staged, like a set that had been carefully maintained over time. I moved through the house slowly, not searching in an obvious way, not opening drawers or turning over objects, but observing. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway leading to the study. Everything in its place. Everything exactly as it should be. That was what made it stand out. Because if there was one thing I understood now, it was that Vanessa did not leave things to chance. She controlled details. She managed appearances, which meant that anything out of place would not be accidental. It would be a signal. I stepped into the study and glanced at the desk we shared, a wide wooden surface that held both of our routines in quiet parallel. My side was simple. A laptop, a few folders, a pen holder. Her side was more precise. Stacked documents, aligned edges, a leather planner positioned at a slight angle that looked casual but was anything but. I walked over and rested my hand lightly on the edge of the desk, my eyes moving across the surface without focusing on any one item too quickly. Then I saw it. Not something new. Something that had always been there, but that I had never thought to question. A small black folder, thinner than the others, tucked just beneath her planner. It was not labeled. It did not stand out. In fact, it was positioned in a way that made it easy to overlook entirely. I reached for it slowly, my movements deliberate, and slid it free from the stack. The material felt different. Not standard office stock. Heavier. More intentional. I opened it carefully, not rushing, not expecting anything dramatic, just letting the contents reveal themselves at their own pace. The first page was simple. A cover sheet with minimal text. No company logo. No decorative elements. Just a name. Not Vanessa Hale. Vanessa Hale. The same variation I had seen in the filings, printed clearly, without explanation. I turned the page. The documents that followed were not contracts in the traditional sense. They were structured differently. Clean, precise language outlining roles, permissions, conditions. Trust documentation. Not the full structure. Not the complete picture Evelyn was still working to uncover, but enough to confirm that this was not something she kept exclusively outside the house. Pieces of it existed here, integrated into her daily environment in a way that made them invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking at. I flipped another page, my eyes scanning quickly but carefully, and then I saw a date. Recent. Within the last few months. An addendum. My fingers paused on the paper, the weight of that single detail settling in. This was not old information stored away and forgotten. This was active, updated, maintained. I read further, my focus narrowing, filtering out everything that did not matter until I found the section that did. Beneficiary conditions. The language was precise, almost clinical, but the meaning was clear enough. Access tied to specific criteria. Control consolidated under defined circumstances. Names listed. Entities referenced. And mine was not there. Not once. Not in any form. Not even indirectly. I closed the folder slowly, my hand resting on the cover for a moment longer than necessary. There was no rush of anger, no immediate reaction. Just clarity. The kind that comes when something you suspected becomes fully real. I placed the folder back exactly where I found it, aligning it with the edge of the planner, restoring the surface to the way it had been before I touched it. Then I stepped back and looked at the desk again, seeing it now not as a shared space, but as a controlled one. Every item placed with intention. Every detail serving a purpose. I turned and walked out of the study, the quiet of the house settling around me once more. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of traffic, the normal rhythm of the evening continuing without interruption. I checked the time. She would be home soon. And for the first time since I walked into that building earlier that day, I understood exactly what I was going to do next. Not confront her. Not yet. Because whatever she had set in motion, whatever she had prepared for, she still believed I did not know. And as long as she believed that, I had something she did not. Time. I heard her car before I saw her. The soft hum of the engine pulling into the driveway, the familiar rhythm of tires rolling over the concrete. Everything exactly as it had been hundreds of times before. I was in the kitchen, standing near the counter with a glass of water I had not touched, my posture relaxed, my expression neutral, every detail of my presence calibrated to match what she expected to find when she walked through the door. The key turned in the lock, the door opened, and a moment later she stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. "I am home," she called out, her voice carrying that same controlled warmth she always used at the end of a long day. I turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge her without making it feel staged. "Hey," I said, keeping my tone even casual. "Long day." She let out a small breath, setting her bag down by the entry table, her movements smooth, practiced. You have no idea, she replied, slipping off her shoes and placing them neatly to the side. Back-to-back meetings. I barely had time to breathe. I nodded once, as if that explanation fit perfectly into the version of her day I had always accepted. Sounds exhausting, I said. She walked into the kitchen then, reaching for a glass, filling it with water, her attention focused on the simple routine. From the outside, nothing about her behavior had changed. The same gestures, the same timing, the same small details that made up the pattern of our daily life. But now, every one of those details felt different. Not false, but incomplete. Like watching a performance where you suddenly realize there is an entire second act happening offstage. She took a sip of water and leaned lightly against the counter, her eyes drifting toward me for a brief moment. "How was your day?" she asked. The question was automatic, part of the rhythm we had built over years, but there was a subtle shift in the way she asked it. Not suspicion, not concern, just a slight recalibration, as if she was checking for something without fully committing to it. I met her gaze for a second, then looked away, keeping my response simple. "Quiet," I said. "Ran a few errands. Nothing major." It was not a lie. It was just not the part of the truth that mattered. She nodded, accepting the answer without pushing further, and moved toward the refrigerator, pulling out a container and setting it on the counter. "I am not really in the mood to cook tonight," she said. "We can just keep it simple." "That works," I replied. I watched her for a moment as she moved around the kitchen, her motions efficient, controlled, every action fitting into a pattern she had perfected over time. If I had not seen what I saw earlier, if I had not read what I read, there would have been nothing here to question. That was the part that stood out the most. Not that she was hiding something, but how seamlessly she maintained both versions of her life without letting them overlap. "Did you end up staying in the office all day?" I asked, keeping my voice light, almost conversational. The question landed exactly where I intended it to. Not direct enough to challenge her, but specific enough to test the consistency of her story. She did not hesitate. "Yeah," she said, opening the container and glancing inside. "Pretty much. I did not even leave the building." I nodded slowly, letting that answer settle into place alongside everything else I knew. "That place must be a lot bigger than I imagined," I said, reaching for the glass of water again, taking a small sip as if the comment was just an offhand observation. She paused for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, then continued with what she was doing. "It is decent," she replied. "Nothing special. Nothing special." I repeated the phrase silently, the words echoing in a way they had never done before. 17 floors. Hidden access. Controlled systems. A trust structure that had been evolving for years. Nothing special. "You should show it to me sometime," I said, my tone unchanged, my posture relaxed. "I have never actually seen where you spend all that time." This time, the pause was slightly longer. Still controlled. Still contained. But there. Present. She closed the container and turned to face me, her expression composed, her eyes steady. "It is not really that kind of place," she said. "Security is tight. They do not allow casual visitors." I gave a small nod, as if that made perfect sense. "Of course," I said. "Just thought I would ask." The conversation moved on after that, drifting back into familiar territory, dinner, small talk, the quiet routines that filled the space between us. But beneath it, something had shifted permanently, not in what was said, but in what was no longer convincing. Because now, every answer she gave was no longer just information. It was data, something to be measured, compared, tested against what I already knew. And as I stood there, watching her move through the kitchen like nothing had changed, I realized that this was exactly where she felt the most secure. Not in that building, not on that hidden floor, but here, in the life we had built together, where she believed her version of the truth was still the only one that existed. And that was the one place she was not expecting to be questioned at all. I did not bring it up that night. Not the building, not the trust, not the name she had been using without ever saying it out loud. I let the evening unfold the way it always did. Dinner at the kitchen counter, quiet conversation that stayed safely on the surface, the kind of routine that builds over years until it becomes almost automatic. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, I had already shifted into a different position. I was no longer participating in the same version of reality she was presenting. I was observing it, measuring it, testing it against what I now knew to be true. After dinner, She moved into the living room with her tablet, scrolling through something work-related, her posture relaxed but focused. I took a seat across from her, not directly facing, just within the same space, close enough to maintain the illusion of normalcy without forcing interaction. Every now and then, she would glance up, offer a small comment about something unrelated, a headline, a message, a passing thought. I responded when appropriate, keeping my tone steady, my words simple, never pushing beyond what she expected. The balance held. Perfectly. Too perfectly. Around 9, she excused herself and went upstairs, mentioning that she needed to review a few things before the next day. That was consistent with everything she had said earlier. Long day. More work to follow. I waited a few minutes before standing, not immediately following, not creating any sense of urgency. Then I moved quietly toward the study again, the same space I had already examined once, but now with a different purpose. Not discovery, confirmation. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me halfway, leaving it slightly open, just enough to avoid drawing attention. The desk was exactly as we had left it. Nothing moved, nothing disturbed. That, more than anything, confirmed that she had no idea I had already been there. I walked over and reached for the same black folder, sliding it out with the same careful precision, opening it to the same section I had seen earlier. The addendum. The beneficiary conditions. This time, I read more slowly, paying attention not just to what was written, but how it was structured. Legal language is designed to be precise, but it also reveals intent through emphasis. Certain clauses were reinforced, repeated in slightly different forms, each one narrowing scope, tightening control. I traced one section with my finger, stopping at a line that had not fully registered the first time. Conditional transfer triggers. The phrase was neutral on the surface, but the implications were not. It meant that control would shift under specific circumstances, predefined, automatic, requiring no additional approval once those conditions were met. I leaned slightly closer, reading the criteria carefully. Timeline-based thresholds. Status changes. Defined events that would activate redistribution without delay. My name was not there, but something else was. A category. Spousal exclusion under restructured terms. It was not written in plain language, but the meaning was clear enough when you understood the context. Whatever she had adjusted 6 months ago, it was not just about control. It was about removing variables, simplifying outcomes. I closed the folder again, more slowly this time, and returned it to its exact position beneath the planner, aligning it precisely with the edge. Then I stepped back and looked at the desk once more, letting the surface return to its original state. I did not rush out of the room. I stood there for a moment, listening. The faint sound of movement upstairs. A drawer opening. Footsteps crossing the floor. Everything normal. Everything exactly as it should be. I turned and walked out of the study, moving back into the living room and taking my seat again, picking up a magazine from the table as if nothing had interrupted the flow of the evening. A few minutes later, she came back downstairs, her expression composed, her movements unchanged. She sat down across from me again, her attention returning to her tablet, the same quiet rhythm resuming without interruption. I glanced at her briefly, just long enough to observe the details I had overlooked for years. The precision in her posture, the controlled pacing of her gestures, the way she managed silence as carefully as she managed conversation. None of it was new. I had just never seen it for what it was. "Everything okay?" she asked without looking up, her voice neutral, casual. I turned a page in the magazine, keeping my tone just as steady. "Yeah," I said. "Just thinking about a few things I need to take care of tomorrow." That was the truth, just not the version of it she would ever expect. She nodded slightly, accepting the answer without question, her attention already shifting back to whatever was on her screen. And as I sat there, the quiet of the room settling around us, I realized that whatever she had set in motion was closer to completion than I had first assumed. The structure was already in place, the conditions defined, the triggers waiting, which meant the only thing left was the moment they were meant to activate. And I had just confirmed that when that moment came, I was not supposed to be part of what followed. The next morning, I woke up before she did. That alone was not unusual, but what was different was the clarity that settled in before I even opened my eyes. There was no confusion left, no uncertainty about what I had seen or what it meant. The pieces had already aligned. The structure was real. The timing was deliberate. And whatever she had set into motion was not hypothetical anymore. It was active. I moved quietly through the house, following the same routine I always did. Coffee first, a brief glance at the news, the steady rhythm of a normal morning. When she came downstairs, everything looked exactly the same as it always had. She greeted me with that same composed warmth, the same controlled tone, as if nothing had shifted between us. And for her, it had not. Not yet. "You are up early," she said, reaching for a cup, her movements smooth, familiar. I nodded slightly, keeping my focus on the coffee maker. "Could not sleep much," I replied. It was close enough to the truth. She did not press. She never pressed when things seemed normal. That was part of the pattern. We moved through breakfast with the same quiet efficiency, small comments, brief exchanges, nothing that required attention. She checked her phone once or twice, responding to messages, her expression tightening just slightly before returning to neutral. I watched it all without reacting, not because I was detached, but because I understood now that observation was more valuable than confrontation. When she finished, she gathered her things with the same precision as always: keys, phone, bag, each item placed exactly where it needed to be. "I might be late again tonight," she said, almost as an afterthought, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. I looked up then, meeting her eyes just long enough to acknowledge the statement. "Busy week," I said. She gave a small nod, satisfied with that answer, and turned toward the door. For a brief second, as she reached for the handle, she paused. Not fully, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough. Then she stepped out, the door closing softly behind her, the sound echoing through the house in a way it never had before. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle again, but this time it felt different. Not empty, not uncertain, just clear. I walked back into the study, not to search, not to confirm anything else, but to stand in the space where I now understood the truth had been sitting all along. The desk was unchanged, the folder exactly where it belonged, everything in place. I did not touch it this time. I did not need to. Instead, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the notebook, flipping to the page I had started the day before. The dates were still there, the connections, the structure. I added one more line, slowly, deliberately. Initiation point. I did not write a date next to it. Not yet, because that part was still forming. But I knew it was coming. Whatever conditions she had defined, whatever triggers she had built into that system, they were not indefinite. They were waiting for something specific. And the moment that something happened, everything would shift. Control, access, ownership, all of it. I closed the notebook and slid it back into the briefcase, my movements calm, controlled. Then I stepped out of the study and looked around the house one more time, seeing it now not as a shared space, but as a boundary. One side of a structure she believed I did not understand. I picked up my keys from the table, feeling the weight of them in my hand, and headed for the door. There were still things to do, calls to make, documents to review, pieces to put into place before whatever she was expecting finally arrived. Because if she had spent years preparing for a future that did not include me, then she had made one assumption that was no longer true. She believed I would only find out when it was too late. And as I stepped outside into the morning light, closing the door behind me, I realized that moment was not hers to control anymore.